In this paper, I will explore the dialectic between the diachronic constitution of literary canons and the momentary fixation of this cultural memory in the form of a reading list. In order to do so, I will focus on one of the most fascinating products of ancient literary criticism, namely the reading list of chapter 10.1 from Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, written in Rome at the end of the 1st century AD. How does Quintilian relate to the rhetorical and critical traditions that preceded him? How does he adapt them to his readership and to his teaching project? To answer these questions, I will highlight some interesting deviations in his list, such as unexpected omissions and surprising inclusions. I will focus today on one example of surprising inclusion, that of the Greek archaic epic poet Pisander, and one unexpected omission, that of Sappho. There is also much to be said about the prose writers and the critical judgments made about the various authors of the list, but time does not allow me to deal with this point in detail today. First of all, a few words on the philological problem posed by the notion of canon. This notion, understood as a selective and closed list of authors considered to be the best representatives of a literary genre, derives from a semantic shift operated by 18th century European philology. This association between list and canon is endorsed in contemporary scholarship on ancient literary canons. The definitions proposed, however, oscillate between the list considered as a whole, the canon in the modern sense of the term, a list of the best, or the canon reduced to one of its items, the canon in the ancient sense of the term, the author serving as a model or standard against which other productions are evaluated. And these two definitions are well explained in Amiel Vardy's definition, which you have on the handout. The work of most 19th and early 20th century philologists focused mainly on the origin of the list elaborated by Greek and Latin rhetors and critics, such as that of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, those of the Ciceronian treatises, that of Quintilian, of course, and that of Dio Chrysostom's Discourse 18th. Much has been written about the relationship between these reading lists and the supposed Alexandrian canons developed by the museum scholars. I have listed some of these scholarship on the handout. It remains difficult, however, given the current state of the sources, to arrive at firm conclusions about the form taken by these Alexandrian canons. For my part, I tend to agree with the reflection begun by August Nock, Aristophanes' editor, and then taken up in part by scholars such as Roberto Nicolai. According to them, the Alexandrian canons can be understood as referring to an informal selection process, which must have concerned authors destined to be the subject of editorial, philological, and/or exegetical work. And nothing allows us to affirm at this stage that it was formalized by the establishment of lists similar to that of Quintilian. So I will start with the case of Pisander. The section of Quintilian's reading list devoted to the Greek poets opens with a list of poets composing in hexameters. From the outset, it is clear that this series is not homogeneous, but has an underlying three-part structure. From 10.146 to 10.154 appear the Greek epic poets of the archaic and classical periods, Homer, Hesiod, Antimachus, Panyasis. In 10.154 to 55, three Hellenistic, epic, didactic, and bucolic poets, Apollonius, Aratos, and Theocritus. And finally, a section that is heterogeneous to the list in 10.156-57, where Quintilian groups together successively the archaic epic poet Pisander, the Hellenistic poets Nicander and Phorion, and the archaic elegiac poet Tyrtaeus. The progression of the entire passage is broadly chronological, from the archaic to the Hellenistic period, despite the anomaly of the inclusion of Pisander and Tyrtaeus. The presence of Tyrtaeus has been explained already by Mario Citroni by the influence of a passage in Horace's Epistula ad Pisones, which you have on the written handout, which mentions Tyrtaeus alongside Homer because of the martial inspiration of his elegies. The selection of the first section, Homer, Hesiod, Antimachus, Paniasis, is identical to that in the corresponding entry in Dionysius Perimimeseus. And the selection of the second section in Quintilian includes authors imitated by the Augustan poets. And the selection of the third section, as we just saw, is more heterogeneous. This underlying tripart structure attracts attention, not only because of the change in periodization, but also because of the change in enunciative form. The latter is particularly noticeable in 10.1, 56-57, where we move to a series of rhetorical questions. This is a polemical use of the sermochinatio, since it is a dialogue between Quintilian and an imaginary interlocutor whose arguments are anticipated and then refuted. By attributing the names of the authors in question to a crowd of rival grammarians, on-raters, or pupils, or even learned contemporaries, Quintilian is ambiguous as to whether or not he includes these authors in his own selection. In my view, if Quintilian's intention was to exclude these authors from his list, he would have been content to omit them altogether. This passage indicates that the four authors included are not quite on the same level as those above. Indeed, we move from the four authors recognized as the most canonical in the critical and literary tradition, Homer, Hesiod, Antimachus, Paniasis, to those whose place in the canon was sanctioned by the Augustan writers, Apollonius, Aratus, and Theocritus, before mentioning those whose canonicity is less obvious, or at any rate belongs to a lower degree than the preceding authors, Pisander, Nicander, Euphorion, and Tyrtaeus. Within the series of Greek epic poets, Pisander is a problematic case. His absence from Dionysius' list and from the section of the list of Greek epic poets that appears most traditional, and his placement in a section introduced by a formulation in which Quintilian explicitly acknowledges that he deviates from earlier selections, allow for some legitimate doubts as to his initial presence within the Hellenistic canons. So the question is, why does Quintilian, who faithfully follows Dionysius for the section on the archaic and classical epic poets, add Pisander to his reading list when his main Greek source for the epic genre does not mention him? Two explanations have been put forward. The first assumes that Pisander was present in the Alexandrian selections and that Quintilian would have excluded him from his list. The second explanation assumes that Pisander's relegation in 10.156 proves his absence in the earlier selections, which Dionysius also reflects. The first explanation seems unconvincing to me because, as I said, if Quintilian wanted to leave Pisander out of his list, he would have simply passed him over in silence, as he does for other poets, well attested in the earlier selections, such as Sappho, Hipponax, and Simonides, for example. Moreover, it would be difficult to understand why two authors so influenced. The second explanation seems more convincing, but I think it is possible to go further. So what then could be the reasons for the inclusion of Pisander? The remark of Quintilian about him, quid Herculis acta non bene Pisandros, gives us some clues. It is essentially for his epic treatment of Heracles' deeds in the Heraclea that Pisander is mentioned. And I believe that it is precisely this importance given to the figure of Heracles that explains its presence. The ideological importance of the figure of Hercules in the Flavian period is paramount, and it is a heroic figure with which the Emperor Domitian claims association. This appropriation by the emperor of the Herculean model is abundantly reflected in Martial's epigrams, as well as in Statius Silvae. This importance of the figure of Hercules in the political context of Domitian's Rome seems to me to be the determining factor in explaining the presence of Pisander in Quintilian's list. In this way, it is possible to go further in the hypothesis concerning the stages of constitution of the canon of Greek epic poets. Pisander could very well have been introduced by Quintilian himself, and this would explain his absence in the earlier selections and his presence from Proclus onwards in the later selections, as well as the instability of his position in relation to the other poets. This addition would therefore be the result of what was initially a marginal modification of the traditional selections under the influence of the Flavian cultural context contemporary with the writing of Quintilian's list. I now turn to Greek lyric poetry and to the absence of Sappho. In 1061, Quintilian specifies that he makes his selection of 4 lyrical poets from a set of 9. The selection of 9 appears in 2 anonymous epigrams in the Greek anthology. The epigram number 184 in book 9 and the epigram 571 in book 9 also. These 2 epigrams were probably composed between the end of the 3rd and the end of the 1st century BC. And the influence of Alexandrian philological works on its constitution is undeniable. With the exception of Ibycus and Stesichorus, all the lyrical poets on the list of 9 had attracted the interest of the museum scholars, especially Aristophanes and Aristarchus. In view of the numerous traces left by the philological activity of the Alexandrian grammarians, it is likely that Quintilian, when he refers to the 9, places his own selection in an intellectual filiation with the scholars of the museum. But it remains to be understood why part of the canonical selection of 9 is omitted. Why does Quintilian, knowing the list of 9 Greek lyrical poets, not reproduce it in full? So to explain the absence of Sappho, Ibycus, Anacreon, Alcman, and Bacchylides, we can exclude from the very beginning the general division between choral and monodic lyrical poetry, since the series of 9 includes, Quintilian selection, includes authors who have distinguished themselves in both. The absence of Bacchylides may be explained by his unfortunate rivalry with Pindar, which is echoed in the early testimonia on both poets. I would like to show that Quintilian's adaptation of the Greek lyrical canon can be explained above all by 3 factors: the influence of Dionysius, the influence of Horace, and especially of the literary history that Horace constructs in his own lyrical production, and finally by the influence, once again, of the ideological and especially moral context of Flavian Rome. The first factor that can be put forward to explain the absence of 5 of the 9 Greek poets enshrined in the tradition is that of the influence of Dionysius and Horace. As has already been noted, Quintilian restricted selection corresponds to that of the Perimimeseos, and the closeness of expression between Dionysius and Quintilian's section on Pindar, Simonides, and Stesichorus is very striking. The absence of certain authors from the selection of the Perimimeseos must, however, be put into perspective. The rhetorical usefulness of some of them is thus emphasized in other critical writings of Dionysius. For example, in Dionysius' treatise on Demosthenes and on the composition of words in De Compositione Verborum, Sappho and Anacreon are presented as models of polished harmony. And as for Horace, it is clear that the four authors mentioned by Quintilian correspond to those Horace names in the 9th poem of Book 4 of his Odes, where he claims the glory of having first introduced the Alcaic stanza to Rome. In the 2nd and 3rd stanza, which you can find on the handout, Horace lists the series of Greek poets to which he aspires to be attached. This so-called microcanon opens with the author holding axiological and temporal primacy, Homer, and closes with a periphrasis pointing to Sappho, Horace's other great lyrical role model, along with Alcaeus. The strophic composition, as you can see, creates a contrast between the first 5 authors, Homer, Pindar, Simonides, Alcaeus, Stesichorus, and the last 2, Anacreon and Sappho. This contrast covers an opposition between major subgenres of lyricism, in particular the political poetry of Alcaeus and the mythologically inspired poetry of Stesichorus on one hand, and the minor subgenres with erotic and sympathic content practiced by Sappho and Anacreon, to which the verb lose it alludes, on the other hand. And it is very interesting to see that Quintilian's selection corresponds perfectly to the authors mentioned in the 2nd stanza, but omits those in the 3rd. In doing so, Quintilian transforms a generic opposition within Greek lyric poetry into an exclusion of the representatives of the lighter side of the genre. So it is the absence of Sappho that is most noticeable, as some scholars such as Mario Citroni and Richard Hunter, who is present with us today, have noted. The absence of the poetess is all the less justified as she enjoys a recognized status within the earlier philological, critical, and rhetorical tradition. She is well represented, for instance, in the Greek rhetorical tradition, as a model for the graces of elegant style in Demetrius, as an illustration of harmony in Dionysius, as expressing certain manifestations of pathos, producing a sublime effect in Longinus, or as a hoard of quotations for epidictic topoi. And moreover, in the Flavian period, it is always a female poetic figure of reference, mentioned as such in Statius and Martial. So the most obvious reason for the omission of Quintilian, which also explains the omission of Ackman, Ibycus, and Anacreon, is the homoerotic theme of Sappho's poems. The lyrical manifestations of homoerotic attraction on the part of Ackman, Anacreon, and Ibycus are already used as an example by Cicero to disqualify the pleasure associated with this kind of passion. And here in this passage, the philosophical condemnation of an uncontrollable passion goes hand in hand with the moral condemnation of what is presented as a Greek behavioral norm alien to Roman culture. So the criterion of morality plays an important role in the constitution of Quintilian's list, especially the remark he adds at the end of the passage on Alcaeus, sed et lusit et in amores descendit maioribus tamen aptior, which does not appear in either Dionysius or Horace, goes in this direction. Ludere refers to the composition of light poetry with a love theme, and Quintilian uses it to mark a generic opposition between 2 categories of lyric poetry: lyric poems with a political subject and erotic poems with a light subject, which Ludere refers to. And superimposed on this generic opposition is another opposition between rhetorically useful poetry, which is close to agonistic eloquence, and useless poetry because it focuses on love. The Flavian cultural and political context undoubtedly had a latent influence in this respect. Under Domitian, the official tendency was indeed to defend good morals. And this has a direct impact on the way Quintilian sees his role as a teacher of rhetoric, because he has to set out an educational program approved by the imperial authority. So the reading program proposed in chapter 10.1 must therefore, I believe, also be read as a series of models in line with the moral and behavioral norms among the Roman elites. And this concern for the morality of teaching in conjunction with reading advice can also be found in the second discourse on kingship by Quintilian's Greek contemporary Dio Chrysostom. This speech, intended to serve as a guide for the king in reading the poets, adopts the form of a fictional dialogue between Philip of Macedonia and Alexander, and Dio leaves it to the character of Alexander to outline the prince's ideal reading program. This passage explicitly states, I think, what in Quintilian remains implicit: the importance of the moral criterion in the selection of authors and the importance of the proximity to Homer. Applied to the lyrical genre, these two criteria result in excluding Sappho and Anacreon from the field of possible readings for a prince, but to retain Pindar and Stesichorus, because the dignity of their verses brings them closer to the Homeric epic, as is made clear a little later in the dialogue. And finally, the unseemliness of writing erotic poetry for a Latin aristocrat of Quintilian's time is also very clear in this passage from the third letter of Book 5 from Pliny's letter. Pliny takes refuge behind a series of Roman authorities who had practiced these games to defend himself from appreciating the writing of this kind of verses. Back to Horace, Horace's influence is also felt in the exclusion dynamic within the lyric canon in Quintilian, I believe. Quintilian takes up several poetic metaphors applied by Horace to the authors of the lyric canon: the metaphor of the river of eloquence for Pindar, and the metaphor of the golden plectrum for Alcaeus. And so this last metaphor is an allusion to the 7th stanza of Ode of the 13th Ode of Book 2 of Horace's Carmina. And this allusion has important implication for the understanding of Quintilian's reconfiguration of the lyric canon. First of all, although in the original context of Horace's ode, the image of the plectrum is used to signify Alcaeus' poetic excellence, its significance is in some ways downplayed by Quintilian. First, the Latin rhetor specifies that this excellence applies only to a part of Alcaeus' poetic work, namely his political poems, before denigrating his poems with an erotic theme, which are nevertheless admired equally by Horace. And secondly, the allusion to Horace's ode functions as a preterition, as Richard Hunter has shown, because by omitting Sappho but mentioning Alcaeus with an allusion to Horace's ode, Quintilian paradoxically draws the attention of the educated reader to Sappho's absence. And this absence is all the more glaring since in the passage in question, Alcaeus and Sappho are named in the same stanza, 2 lines apart. And here, Horace stages a poetic contest in the underworld between Alcaeus and Sappho, from which Alcaeus emerges victorious. And this victory is expressed metaphorically by the image of the golden plectrum. The erotic part of Alcaeus' poetry is entirely overlooked here, even though Horace is well aware of it. And so Horace's synkrisis establishes a generic divide within the Aeolian lyric. It also creates a stylistic opposition between a sentimental style suitable for amorous lamentation, that of Sappho, and a grand and robust style adapted to martial and political themes, that of Alcaeus. And in his allusion to Horace's ode, Quintilian only takes up the results of the synkresis, and it transforms what was in Horace a differentiation made within the Aeolian lyric into a disqualification of Sappho, who is simply excluded from his reading list. So I think that this valorization of Alcaeus at the expense of Sappho could be for Quintilian a way of preparing the supremacy granted to Horace himself in 1096 in the field of Latin lyrical poetry, thus creating a correspondence between the two. So to conclude, the example of Pisander of Sappho shows that Quintilian, in his adaptation of the Greek literary canons, does not hesitate to modify the traditional selections under the influence of the cultural and political context contemporary with the writing of his list, and under the influence of particular literary critics like Horace. And this case study demonstrates how the constitution of the ancient literary canons, far from being fixed or reflecting a consensus, is on the contrary a constantly fluctuating process. The canonical lists thus appear as shifting critical, rhetorical, and philological objects updated in different cultural contexts according to the communities of scholars who established and used them, the public to which they are addressed, and the discursive form in which they are constituted, and the work within which they are inserted. I thank you for your attention.